You look like a cutie patootie. And that's an amazing Barbie, period. I would be delighted to get you one when the opportunity is good. Welcome back to The Hobbit. We are on part 10. Let's continue. We were on a journey to visit our relatives, our nephews and nieces, and first and second and third cousins, and other descendants of our grandfather, who live on the east side of these truly hospitable mountains, said Thorin, not knowing quite what to say all at once in the moment, when obviously the exact truth would not do at all. "He's a liar, oh truly tremendous one," said one of the drivers. "Several of our people were struck by lightning in the cave when we invited these creatures to come below, and they are dead as stones. Also, he has not explained this." He held out the sword which Thorin had worn, the sword which had come from the troll's lair. The great goblin gave a truly awful howl of rage when he looked at it, and all his soldiers gnashed their teeth, clashed their shields, and stamped. They knew the sword at once. It had killed hundreds of goblins in its time, when the fair elves of Gondolin hunted them in the hills or did battle before their walls. They called it Orcrist, goblin cleaver, but the goblins simply called it Biter. They hated it, and worse, they hated anyone who carried it. "Murderers and elf friends," the great goblin called. "Slash them, beat them, bite them, gnash them, take them away to dark holes full of snakes, and never let them see the light again." He was in such a rage that he jumped off his seat himself and rushed Thorin with his mouth open. Just at that moment, all the lights in the cavern went out, and the great fire went off, poof, in like a tower of blue glowing smoke, right up to the roof that scattered piercing white sparks all among the goblins. The yells and yammering, croaking, gibbering and jabbering, howls, growls and curses, shrieking and skirking and following were beyond description. Several hundred wild cats and wolves being roasted slowly alive together would not have compared with it. The sparks were burning holes in the goblins, and the smoke that now fell through the roof made the air too thick even for their eyes to see through. Soon they were falling over one another and rolling in heaps on the floor, biting and kicking and fighting as if they had all gone mad. Suddenly a sword flashed in its own light. Bilbo saw it go right through the great goblin as he stood dumbfounded in the middle of his rage. He fell dead, and the goblin soldiers fled before the sword, shrieking into the darkness. The sword went back into its sheath. "Follow me, quick," said a voice, fierce and quiet. And before Bilbo understood what had happened, he was trotting along again, as fast as he could trot at the end of the line, down dark passages, with the yells of Goblin Hall growing fainter behind. A pale light was leading them all. "Quicker, quicker," said the voice. "The torches will soon be relit." "Half a minute," said Dory, and with the back next to Bilbo, and a decent fellow, he made the hobbit scramble onto his shoulders as best he could with his tied hands, and off they went at a run, with the clink of chains and many a stumble, since they had no hands with which to steady themselves with. Not for a long while did they stop, and by that time they might have been right down into the very mountain's heart. Then Gandalf lit up his wand. Of course it was Gandalf. But just then they were too busy to ask how he got there. He took out his sword again, and again it flashed in the dark by itself. It burned with rage that made it gleam if the goblins were about. Now it was as bright as a blue flame for delight in the killing of the great lord of the cave. It made no trouble whatsoever in cutting through goblin chains and setting all the prisoners free as quickly as possible. The sword's name was Glamdring, the foe hammer, if you remember. The goblins just called it Beater, and hated it worse than Biter, if possible. Orcris, too, had been saved, for Gandalf had brought it along as well, snatching it from one of the terrified guards. Gandalf thought of most things, though he could not do everything. He could do a great deal for friends in a tight corner. "Are we all here?" he said, handing the sword back to Thorin with a bow. "Let me see, that's one, that's Thorin, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, where's Feely and Keely? Here they are, 12, 13, and here's Mr. Baggins, 14. Well, it might be worse, and then again, it might be a good deal better. No ponies and no food and no knowing quite where we are, and hordes of angry goblins just behind. On we go!" And on they went. Gandalf was quite right. They began to hear goblin noises and horrible cries far behind the passages that they had come through. They sent them on faster than ever, and even poor Bilbo could not possibly go half as fast, for dwarves can roll along at a tremendous pace. I can tell you when they have to. They took it in turn to carry him on their backs. Still, goblins go faster than dwarves, and these goblins knew the way better. They had made the pass themselves, and they were madly angry. So that do what they could. The dwarves heard the cries and howls getting closer and closer. Soon they could even hear the flap of the goblin feet. Many feet, which seemed only just around the last corner. The blink of red torches could be seen behind them in the tunnel they were following, and they were getting deadly tired. Why did I ever leave the Hobbit holes?" said Mr. Baggins, bumping up and down on Bomber's back. Why did I ever bring a wretched little hobbit on a treasure hunt?" said poor Bomber, who was fat and staggering along with sweat dripping down his nose in his heat and terror. At this point Gandalf fell behind, and Thorin with him. They turned a sharp corner. "About turn!" he shouted. "Draw your sword, Thorin!" There was nothing else to be done, and the goblins did not like it. They came scurrying round the corner in full cry and found goblin cleaver and foe hammer shining cold and bright right in their astonished eyes. The ones in front dropped their torches and gave one yell before they were killed. The ones behind yelled still more and leapt back, knocking over those who were running after them. "Biter and Beater!" they shrieked, and soon they were all in confusion, and most of them were hustling back the way they had come. It was quite a long while before they had dared to turn that corner. By that time the dwarves had gone again, a long way down the dark tunnels of the goblin realm. When the goblins discovered, they put their torches out and slipped on soft shoes, and they chose their very quickest runners with the sharpest ears and eyes. They ran forward as swift as weasels in the dark, and they hardly made more noise than bats. That is why neither Bilbo, nor the dwarves, nor even Gandalf heard them coming, nor did they see them. But they were seen by the goblins that ran silently up behind them, for Gandalf was letting his wand give out a faint light to help the dwarves as they went along. Quite suddenly, Dory, now at the back again carrying Bilbo, was grabbed from behind in the dark. He shouted and fell, and the hobbit rolled off his shoulders into the blackness, bumped his head on a rock, and remembered nothing more. And now we are moving on to Chapter 5, one of the most famous chapters of The Hobbit, Riddles in the Dark. When Bilbo opened his eyes, he wondered if he had, for it was just as dark with them shut. No one was anywhere near him. Just imagine his fright. He could hear nothing, see nothing, and he could feel nothing except the stone on the floor. Very slowly he got up and groped about on all fours, till he touched the wall of the tunnel. But neither up nor down could he find anything, nothing at all. No sign of goblins, no sign of dwarves. His head was swimming, and he was far from certain even the direction he had been going when he fell. He guessed as well as he could, and crawled along for a good way, till suddenly his hands met what felt like a tiny ring of cold metal lying on the floor of the tunnel. It was a turning point in his career, but he did not know it. He put the ring in his pocket almost without thinking. Certainly it did not seem of any particular use at the moment. He did not go much further, but sat down on the cold floor and gave himself up to complete miserableness. For a long while he thought of himself frying bacon and eggs in his own kitchen at home, for he could feel inside that it was high time for one meal or another. But that only made him miserabler. He could not think of what to do, nor could he think of what had happened, or of why he had been left behind, or why, if he had been left behind, the goblins had not caught him, or even why his head was so sore. The truth was he had been lying quiet, out of sight, out of mind, in a very dark corner for a long while. After some time he felt for his pipe. It was not broken, that was something, and he felt for his pouch, and that had some tobacco in it, and that was something more. And he felt for matches, and he could not find any at all, and he was shattered, his hopes completely. Just as well for him, as he agreed when he came to his senses. Goodness knows what the striking of matches and the smell of tobacco would have brought out in the dark holes in this horrible place. Still, at that moment he felt very crushed. But in slapping all his pockets and feeling around for his matches, he came to the hilt of the little sword, the little dagger he got from the trolls, and he had almost quite forgotten, nor fortunately had the goblins noticed it, as he wore it inside his breeches. Now he drew it out, and it shone pale with the dim light of his eyes. So it is an elvish blade too, he thought, and the goblins are not very near, or not very yet far enough. But somehow he was comforted. It was a rather splendid to be wearing a blade made in Gondolin for the goblin wars, of which so many songs had been sung, and he had noticed that such weapons had made a great impression on the goblins when they came upon them suddenly. Go back, he thought? No good at all. Go sideways? Impossible. Go forward? Only thing to do. On we go. So up he got and trotted along with his little sword held in front of him, one hand feeling the wall, and his heart all a pitter-patter. Now certainly Bilbo was what we call a tight place, but you must remember it is not quite so tight for him as it would have been for me or you. Hobbits are not quite like ordinary people. And after all, their holes are nice, cheery places and properly aired, quite different from the tunnels of goblins. Still, they are more used to tunneling than we are, and they do not easily lose their sense of direction underground, not when their heads had recovered from being bumped. Also, they can move very quietly and hide easily, and recover wonderfully from falls and bruises, and they have a fund of wisdom and wise saying that men have mostly never heard or have forgotten long ago. I should not have liked to have been in Mr. Baggins' place all the same. The tunnel seemed to have no end. All he knew was that it was going down pretty steadily and keeping in the same direction in spite of a twist or a turn or two. There were passages leading off to every side now and again, and he knew by the glimmer of his sword, and he could feel on his hand on the wall. Of these he took no notice, except to hurry past for fear of goblins or half-imagined dark things coming out of them. On and on he went, and down and down. Still he heard no sound of any except the occasional whir of a bat by his ears, which startled him at first, till it came too frequent to bother about. I do not know how long he crept on like this, hating to go on, not daring to stop, on, until he was tireder than tired. It seemed like all the way to tomorrow and over to the days beyond. And we're going to stop there, and if you want to see what this young hobbit runs into, tune in for the next part. I can't wait for you to hear it. Thank you for watching Role Play Riot.